January 1995. New York is gripped by a bitter cold. A man walks into the office of a prestigious Manhattan law firm carrying a folder of documents, papers that will forever change Wall Street's perception of what true success looks like. The name on the documents is Anne Scheiber. She had passed away a few weeks earlier at the age of 101. She had no direct heirs, no husband, and no children. She bequeathed nearly her entire estate to Yeshiva University to support the education of women. The lawyers, well accustomed to the affairs of millionaires, expected to find a few $100,000 in the inventory, perhaps an old apartment. But when they opened the accounts, a deathly silence filled the room. On the accounts of this unassuming elderly woman from Brooklyn lay $22 million. To give you a sense of the scale, in the 90s, this was a colossal fortune. With that kind of money, one could have bought a luxury hotel, a fleet of private jets, or an entire flotilla of yachts. But Anne Scheiber owned none of these things. She lived in a rented apartment with a leaking ceiling and old wallpaper that hadn't been changed in decades. Her refrigerator was often empty, and her wardrobe consisted of a couple of worn-out dresses and a single black coat that she mended with her own hands. The financial world was shell-shocked. Journalists from the New York Times and Forbes rushed to uncover her trail. Who was she? A mathematical genius? The heiress to a secret clan? Or perhaps she had found a way to predict the future. The truth turned out to be far more prosaic and, at the same time, more chilling. Anne Scheiber never worked in banks. She had no access to insider information. All she possessed was an iron will, a long-harbored resentment toward the world, and the $5,000 she started with back in 1944. How does one turn 5,000 into 22 million over 50 years without a voice, without connections, and without support? To understand that, we must return to the beginning of the 20th century, to a world where women were forbidden from even dreaming of financial freedom. To understand the phenomenon of Anne Scheiber, we must transport ourselves back to 1920. America is experiencing a period of explosive growth. But for a young woman from a Jewish family in Brooklyn, the doors of opportunity remained tightly shut, and was gifted with a mathematical mind, a trait considered unfeminine in those days. She managed to achieve the nearly impossible, passing the most grueling exams to secure a position as an auditor for the IRS, the famous Internal Revenue Service. This was an era when women in offices were strictly secretaries or stenographers. Anne, however, was auditing the financial statements of the largest corporations and wealthiest taxpayers. She saw how money moved, how legal loopholes worked, and how vast fortunes were built right before her eyes. But there was one problem within the walls of the IRS, and encountered what we today call the glass ceiling. Year after year, she outperformed her male colleagues. She caught errors that others missed. She was flawless in her calculations. Yet, over 23 years of service, her salary barely moved. Her peak annual income reached just $3,150, while less capable men who arrived after her were promoted and given raises, and remained in the same position. The reason was simple and cruel. The official reports of the time were steeped in blatant prejudice against women and her ethnic background. It was during these years that a cold fury was born within her, and didn't cry, and she didn't complain. Instead, she began to observe. Every day, while auditing the tax returns of millionaires, she asked herself the same question: what do they know that I don't? She noticed a pattern. It wasn't a high salary that made people truly wealthy. It was the ownership of assets. She saw how stock dividends and bond interest created capital that grew on its own while the owners slept. And Scheiber made a decision. If the system would not let her earn money through her labor, she would force the system to work for her. She began to save every single cent from her meager salary. She denied herself new clothes, meals at cafes, and any form of entertainment. Every saved coin was a bullet in her future war for independence. She didn't know yet that her first foray into the market would end in a disaster that would nearly break her. But the foundation of her future empire, a discipline born of resentment, was laid right there, in the dusty archives of the IRS. The year is 1932. America lies in ruins. The Great Depression has swept the rug out from under even the most self-assured titans of industry. Yet it was at this time, when New York skyscrapers looked like monuments to broken dreams, that Anne Scheiber decided to take her first big step. By the age of 50, she had accumulated a modest sum, the result of decades of the most stringent frugality, and believed in numbers. She saw that stock prices had plunged to historic lows and decided this was her chance. She entrusted her savings to a brokerage firm, putting her faith in the professionalism of those who called themselves Wall Street experts. The blow was swift and merciless. The brokerage firm to which Anne had entrusted everything she owned declared bankruptcy. In those days, investor accounts were not government insured. If your broker went under, they took your money down with them. In a single day, Anne Scheiber lost every cent. All those years of denying herself a cup of coffee, all those nights spent auditing others' reports, it all turned to dust because of someone else's incompetence and greed. For anyone else, this would have been the end. People were throwing themselves out of office windows after losing far smaller sums. But Anne was cut from a different cloth. Instead of sinking into despair, she immersed herself in analysis. She reached a conclusion that would define her life for the next 60 years, and realized that on Wall Street, you can't trust anyone. Brokers want your commissions. Managers want your money, but no one wants your success as much as you do. Standing before the mirror in her empty apartment, Anne Scheiber made a vow. Never again will another living soul touch my finances. I will be my own broker, my own analyst, and my own protector. She didn't leave the market. Instead, she decided to become invisible. She began to study the laws of investing the way a hunter studies the habits of prey. She realized that her greatest enemies were not market crashes, but middlemen and her own emotions. Now she knew, to win this game, you had to be prepared to wait for decades. And while America slowly licked its wounds after the Depression, in a small Brooklyn apartment, Anne began compiling a list of companies that would become the foundation of her future empire. She was no longer going to play by someone else's rules. She was creating her own. 1944. The world is engulfed in the flames of World War II, but silence reigns within the offices of the New York IRS. Anne Scheiber is turning 51. After 23 years of impeccable yet undervalued service, she officially retires. Her colleagues likely thought she would spend the rest of her days living out her life on a modest government pension. In their eyes, she was just a lonely woman with no future. But Anne had a different plan. Retirement wasn't the end for her. It was her personal Independence Day. Her starting capital was $5,000, a sum accumulated cent by cent. In today's money, that is roughly $80,000, a solid amount, but completely insufficient to secure a luxurious life in New York for decades to come. Anne knew if she simply spent this money, it would run out in a few years. It was then that she activated her autonomy strategy. Her goal wasn't just to make money, but to build a machine that would feed her forever. She remembered the lesson of 1932. No more middlemen. No more blind faith in experts. She opened an account at Merrill Lynch, but imposed a strict condition. The broker was merely to execute her orders. He had no right to give her advice. He had no right to call her with hot tips, and became her own general headquarters. She understood what millions did not. In 1944, America stood on the threshold of an unprecedented consumer boom. Soldiers were returning home. Families were being started, and suburbs were being built. People were beginning to buy, and decided to become an owner of the very companies that would supply goods to every American home. She began buying stocks not to flip them a week later, but as if she were purchasing a piece of America itself. The first names began to appear in her portfolio: pharmaceutical giants, beverage manufacturers, and food companies. These were businesses that paid dividends, cold, hard cash that, and planned to use as fuel for her financial reactor. For Anne Scheiber, age 51 was the moment of her rebirth. She stepped out from the shadows of the government archives to begin her great game on the chessboard of Wall Street. Every great investor has their own operational headquarters. For the kings of Wall Street, these were luxurious offices overlooking the Hudson, staffed with teams of analysts. For Anne Scheiber, her headquarters became the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. Every morning, as the doors of the majestic building with the stone lions swung open, a petite woman in a modest coat would make her way to the reading room. She didn't have the money for paid subscriptions or personal consultants. But here, on the library shelves, was stored what she valued above all else: information. And spent 10 hours a day reading. She wasn't interested in novels or newspaper gossip. Before her lay corporate annual reports, heavy volumes filled with dry figures, tables, and forecasts, while other investors relied on intuition or tips from acquaintances. Anne Scheiber studied reality. She was an auditor to her core. She didn't read the promotional slogans at the beginning of the reports. She went straight to the balance sheets and looked at debt loads, profit margins, and, most importantly, how a company managed its earnings. She was interested in one key question: how sustainable is this business? If a company dominated its market, carried little debt, and consistently paid out a portion of its profits to shareholders, and added it to her secret list. She became an expert in what is known today as fundamental analysis. She knew the management structures of Coca-Cola or Chrysler better than their own middle managers. The librarians grew accustomed to this quiet woman, who always sat in the same corner, surrounded by mountains of financial literature, and realized a great truth. In the stock market, knowledge isn't just power, it is insurance against risk. In those years, information traveled slowly. By the time news reached the general public, and already knew which company was planning to expand production or acquire a competitor. She didn't just read, she filtered the world through the lens of numbers. Her command center was free, quiet, and incredibly effective. In that reading room, amidst the scent of old paper, Anne Scheiber was building a strategy that, decades later, would make the whole world talk about her. Anne Scheiber's investment style was deceptively simple. While Wall Street was losing its mind trying to predict next week's market fluctuations and thought in terms of decades, her strategy became known as buy and hold. But in her hands, it was taken to the absolute extreme. She never, under any circumstances, sold her shares, and chose companies based on one primary criterion: they had to produce something a modern person could not go a single day without. She called them perpetual engines of consumption. Shares of Coca-Cola and PepsiCo began to accumulate in her portfolio. Her logic was flawless. People will always be thirsty, and they will pay for a familiar taste, no matter what the dollar is worth. She invested in pharmaceutical giants like Bristol-Myers Squibb and Schering-Plough, and knew that illnesses don't take vacations, and that medicine is a business that grows alongside the global population. But there was another side to her strategy, something that today might be called aesthetic intuition, and closely watched what the people around her were buying. She invested in the entertainment industry when it was still in its infancy. She bought shares of Paramount Pictures and Columbia Pictures when cinema became the primary pastime for millions. However, her ultimate secret was a total immunity to market noise. If the stock of a company she considered high quality dropped by 20 or 30% and didn't panic, she didn't call her broker, shouting, "Sell." On the contrary, she viewed it as a seasonal sale. If the company is good and the price has dropped, it means I can buy more for the same money, she told herself. Her portfolio was like a garden. She planted saplings, stakes in corporations, and simply let them grow without digging them up every 5 minutes to check on the roots. This required superhuman patience, while other investors frayed their nerves reading the news. and simply waited. She knew something that Wall Street forgets every day. Wealth is created not by trading, but by ownership. On Wall Street, there is an old saying, "To make money, you have to have money." But Anne Scheiber went further. She believed that every dollar spent on personal comfort was a dollar stolen from her future greatness. Her accumulation strategy turned into a voluntary exile from the world of consumption. With hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of dollars in her account, and lived in conditions that many would describe as poverty. She lived in the same small Brooklyn apartment from the late 1940s until the end. It was a place with a leaking ceiling and creaky floors, where the paint on the walls had begun peeling back when Eisenhower was president. When the landlord offered to make repairs and refused, fearing it would serve as an excuse to raise the rent. Her wardrobe became a legend among the staff at her brokerage firm for years and wore the same heavy black coat and a shapeless hat. If her clothes tore, she wouldn't buy new ones. She mended them herself, often using safety pins. One of her acquaintances recalled that and would walk for hours across the city in the pouring rain just to avoid paying a 15-cent bus fare. Her diet was equally ascetic. She almost never ate at restaurants. Her standard meal consisted of eggs, porridge, and the cheapest vegetables she could find at the market at the end of the day when prices dropped. She turned frugality into a sport where the only judge was her bank statement. By the mid-1950s, something fundamental had happened in Anne Scheiber's life. Her portfolio had ceased to be just a collection of stocks. It had transformed into a living, self-evolving organism. The law that Albert Einstein supposedly called the eighth wonder of the world, compound interest, had begun to work its magic. What was the secret? Most investors, upon receiving dividends, the portion of profit a company pays to its shareholders, would immediately spend them on new furniture, vacations, or dining out. Anne, however, did things differently. She didn't take a single cent out of the system. Every dollar she received was immediately sent back into the fray to purchase new shares of those same companies. This created a feedback loop. More shares brought in more dividends, which were used to buy even more shares, and became a fanatic for reinvestment. For her, a company's dividend announcement was not a celebration of consumption, but one of expansion. She held shares in Plow, Exxon, and Coca-Cola. At a certain point, her holdings in these companies began to grow not because she was contributing her pension savings, but because the shares themselves were giving birth to new shares. Her portfolio began to resemble a snowball rolling down an infinitely long mountain. In the beginning, during the 1940s, the movement was almost imperceptible. But by the 60s, the snowball had become so heavy that it was impossible to stop. Even when the market was turbulent, the influx of dividends remained stable, and understood the ultimate truth of a long-term investor. The stock price on the ticker is merely the opinion of the crowd. Dividends in the account, however, are reality. She stopped looking at price charts. She looked at the charts of her cash flows. By this point, her annual dividend income already exceeded her former IRS salary several times over. She could have bought a mansion, but she continued to live in her old apartment. For her, the true pleasure lay not in possessing things, but in watching her financial army capture more and more territory across corporate America. Once a month, the same scene played out at the luxurious Merrill Lynch offices in Manhattan. Through the massive doors, past the impeccably dressed doormen, walked a tiny, hunched-over old lady. She looked like someone who had either gotten the wrong address or had come to beg for alms. She wore the same black coat, patched over and over again, and a vintage hat. She walked slowly, leaning on an umbrella or a cane. Young traders in perfectly pressed shirts and $500 ties followed her with mocking stares. Behind her back, they whispered, "There goes that crazy bag lady again." They didn't know that this crazy woman could have had them all fired simply by calling their management. At that moment, her portfolio already held more shares of Dow Jones companies than those of most of their high-status clients, and never used the services of consultants. She would walk up to the desk of her broker, William Fay, the only person in the office, who knew her secret and treated her with respect. She didn't ask for his opinion on the market. Instead, she would pull a slip of paper from her worn-out bag with the names of companies and the number of shares she wanted to purchase that day neatly written out. For Anne, these visits to Merrill Lynch were a kind of ritual. It was the only moment when her financial superiority collided with reality. She saw the luxurious interiors, the leather chairs, and the expensive watches on the clerk's wrists. But she looked at them with a faint, barely perceptible smirk. She knew the truth. They worked for commissions. While she owned the assets, they were the servants of capital. She was its mistress. She was a ghost in the system, an invisible shareholder. On the lists of corporate owners, her name stood alongside the heirs of America's wealthiest families. Yet none of them had ever met her at social galas or charity balls. And Scheiber relished this anonymity. To her, true power lay not in being recognized, but in possessing resources while remaining out of reach. She was the quintessential hidden investor, a person who proved that Wall Street doesn't care about your appearance, your last name, or your connections. The only thing that mattered in her investment account was the number of zeros, which grew every year while those who mocked her continued to live paycheck to paycheck. And Scheiber's wealth grew at a frightening speed, but her world was relentlessly shrinking. By the 1970s, she possessed millions that could have bought her any company or any adventure. Instead, however, the money became her self-imposed prison and had no family. She had never married. She had no children, and her few relatives had either passed away or long since lost touch with her. No children's laughter echoed in her apartment, and no dinners were ever hosted for friends. The only living beings in her life were the figures in financial reports and her broker, with whom she communicated strictly on business terms. Psychologists often wonder, why does a person need so much money if they have no intention of spending it? In Anne's case, the answer was grim. Her obsession with accumulation was a form of defense against a world that had once rejected her. For her, money was not a means of living, but the only way to feel a sense of control. Every new million in her account was another brick in the wall separating her from the poverty she had witnessed during the Great Depression. She lived in a state of constant scarcity, even when she was fabulously wealthy. This is the paradox of survivor psychology. A person becomes so accustomed to struggling for existence that, once they have won, they simply do not know how to enjoy a world without war. She was not happy in the conventional sense of the word. Acquaintances remembered her as a sharp, suspicious, and extremely reclusive woman. She saw people only as those who wanted to lay claim to her fortune. Her only entertainment was watching her financial soldiers bring her new victories. She fell asleep counting dividends in her head and woke up to check if the world had collapsed while she slept. And Scheiber became a victim of her own success. She proved to the world that she could become wealthier than any man on Wall Street. But in that pursuit, she forgot to buy herself a life. Her story serves as a reminder that capital without a purpose is nothing more than dry figures in a safety deposit box. She owned a piece of America, yet in her empty Brooklyn apartment, she was the loneliest person in that vast city. The 1970s went down in U.S. history as the decade of nightmares. The golden age of post-war prosperity had come to an end. The country was engulfed by stagflation, a monstrous combination of economic stagnation and skyrocketing prices. Inflation devoured Americans' savings like a wildfire. People watched as the nest eggs they had set aside for old age turned into worthless scraps of paper. The stock market was in a fever. The Dow Jones Industrial Average went nowhere for 10 years. And in real terms, adjusted for inflation, it was plummeting into an abyss. For most investors, it was a time of panic. They watched the value of their shares drop and sold off their assets in terror, trying to salvage at least the remnants of their money. But Anne Scheiber just kept reading her reports in the library. She understood what the crowd did not. Inflation is a tax on those who keep their money under the mattress or in fixed-rate bonds. But inflation is a gift to those who own high-quality businesses. and placed her bet on companies with pricing power. She knew that if the prices of sugar and aluminum went up, Coca-Cola would simply raise the price of a can of soda. If drug development costs rose, the pharmaceutical giants would pass those expenses on to the consumer. Her companies were not just lines in a ledger. They were living mechanisms that adapted to inflation faster than the Fed's printing press. While others were jumping ship and used her dividends to buy even more, she knew that during a crisis, stocks were being given away for a song. She was buying real assets when everyone else wanted nothing but cash. By the end of the 70s, as the smoke cleared and inflation began to subside, the world found itself in a new reality. Those who had panicked were left with nothing. But Anne Scheiber's portfolio, tempered in the fires of the crisis, was poised for the most powerful surge in human history. She hadn't just preserved her millions. She had built the foundation for them to transform into tens of millions in the coming 80s. By the early 1990s, the world of finance had changed beyond recognition. Paper filing systems had been replaced by computers, and quiet reading rooms by aggressive trading terminals. But in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, 90-year-old Anne Scheiber continued to do what she had always done. She waited and she calculated. The figures she saw in her statements were beyond the realm of imagination. Her initial $5,000, invested in 1944, had transformed into a colossal $22 million. This was more than just a success. It was one of the most effective investment results in the history of private capital. Her portfolio now consisted of shares in more than 100 companies. She owned massive blocks of stock in Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. Every year, these companies paid her over $200,000 in dividends alone. Think about that for a moment. She was receiving nearly $250,000 a year just by sitting in an armchair. It was more than the salary of the President of the United States at the time. She could have had black caviar for breakfast at the Ritz, flown on private jets, and bought estates in France. But the summit of her financial Olympus looked very different. She still lived in that very same rented apartment. She still ate simple porridge and wore that same patched-up black coat. When her broker, William Fay, once suggested that she finally buy herself something worthy of her fortune, and simply looked at him with her icy stare and replied, "Why would I spend money on things that don't pay dividends?" For Anne Scheiber, money had ceased to be a medium of exchange entirely. It had become her score in a game where she had beaten everyone. She had proven to the system that once discriminated against her that she, an IRS auditor, was smarter, more patient, and stronger than all of them combined. She possessed millions, but the millions did not possess her. In her world, numbers were the only truth, and everything else was dust. She had achieved absolute financial freedom, but the paradox was that she was the only person on the planet who, as a matter of principle, never made use of it. All her life, Anne Scheiber remained silent. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and never explained her actions to her neighbors. But when the lawyers opened her will, the silence exploded into a manifesto she had been preparing for decades. Her entire massive fortune, all $22 million, was bequeathed to a single institution, Yeshiva University in New York. However, the document contained one strict, unwavering condition. This money was not to go toward the construction of new buildings or professors' salaries. Every cent of those millions was earmarked for a scholarship fund for women, those who, like Anne herself 70 years earlier, possessed talent and ambition but lacked the means or support to shatter society's glass ceiling. She never forgot the slights inflicted upon her in the 1920s. She never forgot how her talents as an auditor were ignored simply because she was a woman. But instead of spending her money on personal revenge or luxury, Anne chose to buy a future for thousands of other young women. She wanted to ensure that no talented female student would ever again have to choose between dropping out or living in poverty. Her millions became a bridge over the chasm of injustice. Thanks to her asceticism, thousands of women were given the opportunity to become doctors, lawyers, scientists, and financiers. Her broker, William Fay, would later say, She didn't save because she was greedy. She saved because she was building an army of educated women who would change the world. At this moment, the portrait of Anne Scheiber transforms. We no longer see a lonely old woman in a tattered coat, but a strategist who sacrificed her own comfort for a grand purpose. She lived in the shadows so that others could step into the light. Her $22 million became the largest private donation in the history of that university, made by a person who was never once listed in the pages of Forbes. In December 1995, New York was unusually quiet, and Scheiber passed away at the age of 101. She departed just as she had lived for the past half-century, without noise, without an entourage, surrounded only by her faithful papers and financial statements. In her final days, there was no one by her side except for a caregiver and her lawyers. Outside her window, the world continued to hurtle toward the internet age. The Dow Jones was storming new heights, and the corporations she owned continued to sell their goods across the globe, and had fulfilled her mission. She had outplayed time itself. A few weeks after her funeral, a media storm erupted. The executors of will opened the accounts and gasped in disbelief. The news of the secret Brooklyn millionaire spread across the globe faster than stock quotes. The New York Times dedicated a massive feature to her. TV channels scrambled to find her neighbors, trying to understand how they could have failed for decades to notice a person whose fortune exceeded the budgets of small towns living right beside them. People were shocked not by the amount, but by the contrast. Photos of her modest home were juxtaposed with charts showing the exponential growth of her capital. Journalists dubbed her the Mother Teresa of investing. Though, and was far more austere, she became living proof that a system built on discrimination could be defeated using its very own weapons. Her death marked the conclusion of one of the longest financial experiments in history. Over 51 years in the market, she never made a single major mistake because her primary strategy was the absence of action. She was the embodiment of the passive investor who conquered an aggressive world. She passed away, leaving behind $22 million and a question that still haunts everyone who hears her story. Was it worth it? But for Anne herself, the answer was obvious. She hadn't just accumulated money. She had accumulated power over a destiny she never possessed in her youth. And now, that power was to pass into the hands of those in whom she believed most. The story of Anne Scheiber might seem extreme, almost unbelievable. But behind the facade of her eccentric lifestyle lie universal laws of wealth that work just as effectively today as they did 80 years ago. What did this woman truly leave us? Besides millions for a university, she left us a code of financial independence consisting of 5 fundamental rules. Rule 1. Time is your greatest asset, and started with 5,000. But she had 50 years. Most people lose not because they are foolish, but because they are in too much of a hurry. Compound interest is like a tree. You cannot plant it in the morning and expect shade by lunchtime. Rule 2. Buy what you understand. And didn't look for the next Bitcoin. She bought soda, medicine, and movies, things people will always consume. True wealth is built on boring, understandable, and stable businesses. Rule 3. Ignore the noise. She didn't listen to experts, watch the news, or panic during crises, and knew that the market is a pendulum, forever swinging from euphoria to despair. To win, you must remain still while everyone else is running. Rule 4. Reinvest everything. The secret to her $22 million was not rising stock prices, but the fact that she never withdrew her dividends. Every penny went back to work. She understood that capital is an army. If you eat your soldiers, there will be no one left to fight. Rule 5. Purpose is more important than comfort. Wealth is not what you spend, but what you own, and chose freedom and the chance to change the future for thousands of women instead of buying things she didn't need. Today, in the era of fast money and flashy social media images, Anne Scheiber reminds us of the opposite, the quiet power of discipline and the greatness of patience. She proved that anyone, regardless of their starting point, gender, or profession, can become the master of their own destiny. You don't need to live in poverty or patch your coat with safety pins. But you should certainly learn from Anne's greatest quality, the ability to look beyond the horizon. After all, in the end, true investing is not just about numbers on a screen. It is about how your patience today changes the world tomorrow. And Scheiber has made her move. Now it's your turn.